uprising in 1791 and leading to the independence of Haiti after the defeat of Napoleon's army on January 1st, 1804. It was not described at the time by the people who participated in it as the Haitian Revolution. In fact, until the blacks defeated the French and declared their independence and decided to call their new country Haiti, that name wasn't even used, so nobody could have described it as the Haitian Revolution. But if you do a Google search to see who used the term Haitian Revolution to describe those events in the 19th century, it was almost exclusively African American writers here in the United States. It was not a term that was used in Haiti itself. It was not a term that was used by white writers discussing these events anywhere else. White authors in the United States continued to refer to the country by its colonial French name, Saint-Domingue or Santo Domingo, well into the 19th century, as if they wanted to deny that Haiti had become an independent country. But African American authors already called it the Haitian Revolution, and I think that speaks very strongly to what this story of how the black population of this island in the Caribbean had gained its independence meant to African Americans in their own struggles in the 19th century. We are, as Charles Farrell mentioned, observing today, commemorating the 226th anniversary of the start of the slave uprising that eventually led to the Haitian Revolution and the independence of Haiti. The only truly successful slave revolt in history, and one that led to the creation of the first independent black nation in the Americas, and the first country anywhere in the world where slavery was permanently abolished as part of the country's constitution. So we're talking about, we're talking about an event that is well worth applauding and a very important event in the history of the development of our ideas about liberty and equality in the modern world, and a very important event also for understanding how the issue of race has affected the definition of liberty and equality. The man who emerged as the leader of the movement that led to the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture, is a major figure in world history. His achievements showed that a former black slave could command armies, conduct skillful diplomacy, and run a government. And he commanded the respect of the white world of the time, and is the best known figure to come out of the Haitian Revolution. I got into studying the Haitian Revolution, however, from a rather different angle. By profession, I am a professor of the history of the French Revolution. And I have to say that when I was taking my own courses on the French Revolution in the 1960s and 1970s when I was a student, the events in the French colonies in the Caribbean were hardly ever mentioned. In the books that I was assigned to read by my own professors, there might be at best a sentence or two about them. There was rarely even any acknowledgement that in these French colonies, there lived in 1789, when the French stormed the Bastille in Paris and began their own movement for freedom, there lived in the French colonies 700,000 black slaves, more than the population of slaves in the 13 American states at that point. So there was almost no acknowledgement in the training I got about the French Revolution that slavery was a major issue in the French Revolution, an issue that affected the careers of almost every leading political figure in the revolution, and an issue that mattered tremendously to the French. Above all, the most important of these colonies that France had in 1789 was the colony called Saint-Domingue, which occupied the western part of the island of Hispaniola. Was divided with a Spanish colony, Santo Domingo, which is today's Dominican Republic, and this western territory, of course, is the modern nation of Haiti. As Charles Farrell already mentioned briefly, this was one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the world in 1789. Even though the French colony of Saint-Domingue is barely the size of the American state of New Jersey, it produced half of the entire world's supply of two commodities with which civilized life was already unimaginable by the end of the 18th century: coffee and sugar. And so the coffee and sugar exported from Saint-Domingue was enormously important to the French economy. It supplied not only French coffee drinkers, but also people who needed their morning joe in all the rest of Europe. And that is what made the colony so important. And that is why the colony was so desperately dependent on slave labor. In order to grow the sugar, grow the coffee on the plantations there, the French had long since concluded that white laborers could not be made to do this backbreaking work in the hot Caribbean sun, and they had made Saint-Domingue the single biggest market for slaves imported from Africa to keep these plantations going. At the time of the French Revolution, then, there were 500,000 slaves in the island of Saint-Domingue, 10 black slaves for every white person on the island, or more than 10. And this is what, of course, the basic fact that made the Haitian Revolution possible, the fact that the black population so heavily outnumbered the whites. The French Revolution began, as I hope many of you know, by declaring that it was a basic principle, a basic human right, that all men are born and remain free and equal in rights. And this principle obviously contradicted the institution of slavery in the French colonies. Some of the French revolutionaries realized this from the start of the revolution, and you can see in this engraving from the early years of the revolution that some of them recognized that if you were going to proclaim that all men are free and equal, then this principle has to be applied to people of black skin as well as those of white skin. Here you see the level of equality being applied to the whites and the blacks. But to translate this into a decision to free the blacks in the French overseas colonies faced tremendous opposition. There were very powerful economic interests tied up with the slave system in the Caribbean. Many families in France owned property in the colonies, even though often they had never seen their plantations. Many of them had lent money to, many French banks had lent money to planters in the Caribbean and feared that they would not get it back if the slaves were freed. So although the principle of the French Revolution seemed to indicate that slavery had to be abolished, in fact, the French revolutionary legislators waited for some 4 years after the revolution started before they were willing to grant freedom to their slaves. On February 4th, 1794, however, having recognized that they could not defeat the slave insurrection that had begun in Saint-Domingue in August of 1791, France's National Convention took a historic step and decreed the abolition of slavery throughout the French colonies. This rather fanciful engraving from France in 1794 shows grateful black people supposedly thanking the French legislators for what they had done. In fact, there were very few blacks in Paris at the time of the revolution. And in Paris in February, I don't think anybody like this black man on the right side of the picture would be going around with no shirt in the middle of the winter and holding a naked child in the winter weather. But it expresses the tremendous outpouring of emotion generated by this epoch-making French decision. The French also granted the rights of citizens to all the blacks in their colonies, and even had some of them seated as voting deputies in the national legislature. France moved with remarkable speed from having had hundreds of thousands of slaves to incorporating them into its national life. This is a picture of a man named Jean-Baptiste Belay. He had been born in Senegal, had been taken as a slave to Saint-Domingue, had been freed before the revolution, served in the French army during the revolution. In 1794, he became the first black man to sit in the legislature of any European country, and he remained a legislator for 4 years. And this very famous, now very famous portrait of him hangs in the History Museum at the Palace of Versailles in Paris. So we now recognize that the struggle about slavery, the debates about it, the debates about how to react to the uprising in Saint-Domingue were a tremendously important dimension of the French Revolution, and that the French revolutionaries went rather abruptly from trying to defend the slave system in the first years of the revolution to not only abolishing slavery, but also trying to integrate blacks into French society in the second half of the 1790s. A movement that tragically would be reversed very abruptly by the French national hero Napoleon Bonaparte when he came to power. In 1802, Napoleon restored slavery in the overseas French colonies. This led to the last and bloodiest stage of the struggle in Haiti, what Haitians called the War of Independence, which ended with the defeat of Napoleon. He was unable to force the blacks in that colony back into slavery. But in the other French colonies, slavery was reintroduced after 1802, abolished again in 1848, which sometimes allows my French professor friends to remind me that France is the only country that had the honor of abolishing slavery twice. The United States can only claim to have done it once, but it has that honor because of what Napoleon did. I can't help reflecting in the debate we're having right at the moment about statues of people who fought to defend slavery, whether this debate will be extended to France, how many thousands of statues, busts, portraits of Napoleon are still in French public buildings that would have to be removed if the French are going to take the same position. Thank you, but don't say I predicted this is going to happen anytime soon. So, what can I tell you this evening that goes beyond this story that probably many of you in this audience already know the basic outlines about? What I would like to try to show you or share with you, one thing that I have studied, especially in my own work, is the individual experiences of people who participated in the Haitian Revolution. what it meant to specific individuals, what they did, how they reacted when they found themselves caught up in this great historical drama. One of the things that I have studied in my own work have been the first-person accounts of people who were actually there. Now, it is right about the time of the Haitian Revolution that a man named Olave Equiano published the very first slave narrative, the very first story of the life of a black African who had been a slave, told by himself. And in this book, the interesting narrative of the life of Olave Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa, that was his slave name that he had been given, the African, written by himself. This book appeared in England in 1789. Equiano allowed readers to enter into the life of a black slave who had been separated from his family as a child, had been bought and sold several times, first in Africa, who had managed to survive the Middle Passage that is so vividly recreated in the exhibit here in the Walker Museum, who had been fortunate enough to find opportunities to learn to read and write, who in his life as a slave in the Caribbean was nevertheless able to earn enough money to actually buy his own freedom, and he reproduced in his autobiography, his life story, the document by which he had gained his freedom as a young man. Equiano's story also had a powerful impact on readers because it was a spiritual journey, and he told readers about his long search for what he thought was the true religion, the true interpretation of Christianity, which he found in the Methodist Church. And it was a story of how he became involved in the struggle to abolish the slave trade. His book made a very important contribution to the developing movement to abolish the slave trade in England, and he himself was appointed as part of an expedition to what became the British colony of Sierra Leone, where he went hoping that this might be the part of Africa where blacks could be given their freedom and where emancipated slaves could be settled. So Equiano demonstrated the tremendous impact that stories of life under slavery and escape from slavery told by people who had actually experienced this could have on readers of all races, really. Equiano's book was very rapidly translated into a number of other European languages. It was published in the United States, as well as in Britain and in Ireland. It was a bestseller for its time, and Equiano actually made quite a bit of money from the book. It could not have had much impact in Saint-Domingue, however, because curiously the one European language it was not translated into was French. Not until the late 20th century was it made available in a French translation. Well, I have done a good deal of research on first-person accounts from people who lived through the events of the Haitian Revolution. They also show the tremendous power of first-person narrative, but the first thing I have to tell you about these accounts is they are all by white authors. There are no known accounts of the experience of the Haitian Revolution by blacks, except for a rather limited and disappointing memoir written by Toussaint Louverture at the end of his life when he was taken prisoner by the French, and he tried to recount all the great things he had done for the benefit of the French when he had been a general in the French army. He says nothing about his own life as a slave or how he achieved his freedom or his participation in the early stages of the Haitian Revolution. So these accounts are by whites, many of them slave owners. Not all of them have been slave owners. There is, for example, an account, you'll find selections from it in my book, Facing Racial Revolution, by someone who had been a 12-year-old boy in Saint-Domingue who arrived there by accident. He happened to be on a ship in a French harbor in 1803 along with his father. His father was saying goodbye to some friends who were going with the French army to fight against the Haitian War for Independence. The ship left without giving them a chance to get back on shore. This 12-year-old boy found himself in Saint-Domingue in the middle of the fighting. His father died of yellow fever, which killed so many of the French soldiers. He luckily for him, managed to get back to France. He has some interesting things to say about his experiences there, but he was not himself a slave owner. For the whites who wrote these books, they were usually opportunities to talk about what they thought of as the terrible things that had happened to them, rather than the terrible things that they might have been involved in doing as slave owners. Many of them are what we call captivity narratives, stories of people who were taken prisoner by the black slave insurgents and then managed to escape or be rescued. This is an illustration that comes from one of these stories. One of these whites thought that his experiences and the experiences of his family would make a good play, and he wrote out the story as a theater piece, and he made a series of little colored drawings that how he thought the thing might look on stage. So this represents the kind of story that you find in many of these accounts about captivity. Here you can see the white family, the parents tied up on the ground here, the two daughters tied to stakes, and the leader of this black band of soldiers telling them what they have to do if they want to survive. So we have many stories of this sort from whites. Another very common trope that appears over and over again in these stories is the story of the loyal slave who defends his master and saves his life or the life of his family. Now, both of these kind of stereotype stories, being taken prisoner and nearly being killed and of being rescued by loyal slaves, they certainly happened many times during the Haitian Revolution. We know, for example, that the future Toussaint Louverture, the first thing he did when the slave uprising broke out was to escort the family of his former owner to safety. The owner, his wife, and his child. He could have been featured in one of these loyal slave, or in his case, ex-slave, because he was already a free man at the time of the Revolution. So these stories tend to emphasize, of course, what happened to the whites during the Haitian Revolution, not so much what happened to the blacks. Nevertheless, these stories often do tell us very interesting things about individual black participants in the slave uprising. I have sometimes come to think of these narratives as being a little bit like these body cameras that policemen are now being made to wear. They often wind up revealing things that maybe the narrators of these stories, that wasn't what they really had in mind, but in the course of explaining what happened to them, they tell us very important things about the blacks that they encountered during the Revolution. So my purpose in studying these stories has certainly not been to try to generate sympathy for their white authors, but instead to read them, as we often say in academia, against the grain. to find messages in them that maybe were not the conscious messages that their authors intended, but are nevertheless in there. In the course of describing their own experiences, every one of these authors described encounters with black participants in the uprising and the struggles of these years. Often they give us the exact words spoken to them by some of these blacks. These are among the first passages, often in the language of Haitian Creole, that were written down. Some of the very first evidences of how Creole had developed as a language at that time. So often they give us very important insights and very important pictures of black participants in these stories. Often they tell us very surprising stories that show us all the complexities of the Haitian Revolution that tend to get kind of faded away when we concentrate just on the heroic story for freedom. They remind us, among other things, as I hope you'll see in the coming minutes, that even the decision to join that struggle meant a decision to risk your life, a decision to take a very desperate gamble in these circumstances, and a decision that for some of the participants was not an easy one to take. So I'd like to share with you a couple of very striking passages from several of these stories and talk about what they do add to our understanding of the Haitian Revolution. The first of the stories I'm going to talk about, we don't know the name of this author. We know that he managed a large plantation, and as you'll see in a moment, a plantation that was right at the center of the Haitian uprising at its beginning, a plantation known as the Clément plantation, so we refer to him as the manager of the Clément plantation, and he was taken prisoner on the very first night of the uprising, August 22nd, 1791. He was asleep in his bedroom, and a group of blacks burst in and held him captive. And he, of course, like many whites who were taken prisoner, expected that he would very shortly be killed as this uprising broke out. But here's what actually happened to him on the first night, as he tells it. The commander of this bloody horde, named Boukman, whom I had always treated well, arrived at this point, and seeing me in my room, whose door was half broken, all bloody and desperate, had pity on me. He addressed his men and told them firmly, "Don't kill him. He's a good white and knows more than the others around here." When I had surveyed the plantation, I had chosen him as an assistant because he was the most intelligent of them. He had been astonished to see that I could determine the distance from one point to another without pacing it off, using surveying tools. So I was quite surprised to hear such words because I would not have thought him susceptible in these circumstances of so much humanity. Well, what's important, what's striking about this passage? First of all, it reminds us that the Haitian Revolution was a struggle between people who often knew each other personally. The manager of the Clément plantation managed the plantation on which Boukman Duty, the leader of the slave uprising, had been a slave. And he had, as he says, talked to Boukman. He had realized that Boukman was an intelligent man, somebody who asked questions and wanted to understand what was going on and what this white man was doing with these surveying tools, for example. And on the other side, this white man had recognized that Boukman was highly intelligent. He wasn't just another ignorant slave. He was clearly a man who thought about things, asked questions to learn about things. So we have two people here who sort of recognize each other as individuals and know something about each other than just the fact of one of them is white and manages slaves, and the other is black and is a slave. But Boukman decides to save his life. And that gave the manager of the Clermont plantation a chance to see some of the qualities that made Boukman the leader of this movement. Here's another passage from his account. He watched as Boukman went into the slave quarters where the slaves who didn't know about the plot to start the insurrection were. He writes, Boukman, who no doubt had more at stake than the others in making sure that things didn't stop there, planted himself behind them and struck them with his rifle butt. March, Negro dogs, march, or I'll shoot you down. And in this passage, we can see something about Boukman, that he's very determined. He's going to get this insurrection going no matter what. But we can also get a glimpse of what must have gone through the minds of the other black slaves who hadn't been in the plot in advance. And they've got to make a decision from one moment to the next. Do I get myself involved in this uprising? Do I take the chance that if it fails, I'll be killed or very severely punished? Or is it better to try to stay out of trouble, to try to stay on the sidelines, to let other people take the chances? And I think it's a very human reaction to think that the answer is not necessarily obvious. And we can see that Boukman had to work to get some of these blacks to make that decision that he was able to get them to do. Excuse me, just a second. Okay. And then another very significant passage from the Clermont manager's account. So he is taken prisoner, he is put under guard by the blacks, and here's the last passage I'll read to you from his account. He writes, I started a conversation with two black guards, Jean-Jacques, who belonged to the Comte de Noé, and Vincent, who belonged to his cousin. I asked them who could be the instigators of such a vast event, and what their purpose was in committing so many crimes. They answered that it was the high-ranking whites of France, that their goal was to punish us, that is, the whites in the colony, for having dethroned the king, and because we no longer had either faith or law or religion, and because we had burned the royal decree that gave the blacks 3 free days a week at Port-au-Prince. They said the aim of the revolt was a vast project which consisted of nothing less than the destruction of all the whites except some priests, some surgeons, and some women, and of setting fire to all the plantations and making themselves masters of the country. I showed them how astonished I was at everything they told me. I asked them why they were sparing the priests, the surgeons, and the women. They replied that they were keeping the priests so that their religious services could be held, the surgeons to heal their maladies, and the women to take for their own and get pregnant, as well as a few whites to organize them. So here we have a statement of the program of the uprising, or at least as these two participants in it understood it, and that's very important because the blacks who participated in this uprising, they did not write a Declaration of Independence as Thomas Jefferson had for the American revolutionaries in 1776, or a Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen as the French revolutionaries had in 1789. So it's not so clear, it's not so obvious from what they did, what they had in mind, what they thought they were fighting for in this struggle that they had launched. So this account by the manager of the Clermont plantation is the most complete version we have of a revolutionary program in the minds of the black participants. It shows that they understood or thought they understood a lot of things about the French Revolution. They understood that there was a division in France between the king and his supporters and the people who called themselves revolutionaries and were trying to overthrow the monarchy in France. It shows, and this may strike you curiously, that they thought the side that was sympathetic to them was not the white revolutionaries who had said men are born and remain free and equal, and then had maintained the system of slavery in the French colonies. They thought King Louis XVI was the man who was more sympathetic to them. And they even believed, and this was a widespread rumor, even though it was not true, that Louis XVI had issued a decree promising 3 days a week for slaves in the colonies to work to earn money for themselves so that they could buy their freedom from their owners. So we can see that this insurrection starts as a royalist movement. It's a revolt against the French Revolution. It's not a demand that the revolutionaries carry out their promises. It's an attempt to say, you didn't offer us freedom, you haven't extended liberty and equality to us. We think the king is more sympathetic to us, and we hope that he will grant us these rights. And finally, it shows us that they had some vision of what they might accomplish if they won here. They were thinking about how they would organize a society run by blacks, dominated by blacks. They were not simply indulging in a random outbreak of violence, as this engraving from France suggests, or as the pictures that got back to France of the burning of the plantations and the start of the uprising suggested. They were not simply destroying, but they also had a vision of what they would create if they won. And we can see that they intended to keep some features of the colonial society. They wanted those priests. It's clear that the participants in the Haitian Revolution were aware that the French Revolution had taken a very hostile turn against the Catholic Church. To the black population of Saint-Domingue, the idea of a society without priests, without religion, was very difficult to conceive. They wanted to keep the priests there to continue holding services for them. They mentioned they wanted to keep the surgeons. They had a respect for the medical knowledge of the European world and wanted to continue to have the benefits of it. And they wanted to overturn the situation in which white men had been able to exploit black women at will, and they imagined, of course, reversing that situation. They would keep the white women and subject them to the kind of treatment that they had, black women had suffered at the hands of white men. This element of sexual revolution, you might call it, is even clearer in another passage in the Clement manager's account. He mentions an incident of a white man on another plantation who had been shot by the blacks and left for dead, but he wasn't actually dead. He's lying on the ground, and the Clement plantation manager writes, "Some black women wanted to give themselves the barbaric pleasure after that of letting him smell their private parts. This poor white, having had the misfortune to show a sign of life, was beaten some more by these terrible women. They kept threatening him and told him, if we had known you weren't dead, we'd have called the black men to finish you off." And I think this passage very vividly illustrates to us how black women felt about the treatment they had received from white men under slavery, and how they decided to take their revenge when the uprising gave them that opportunity. So the account by the Clermont manager is certainly a very vivid picture of the Haitian Revolution, and I think allows us to enter into the minds of some of the black participants who could not write their own experiences down themselves, but this white man, whether he meant to or not, has given us these insights into them. Another very interesting account, one of the ones that I first encountered and got me interested in this subject, is an account called My Odyssey, or Mon Odyssée, that was not published at the time, and only became sort of visible, so to speak, when a version of it was published in English in 1959, translated by a woman in New Orleans, and published as My Odyssey. And she thought that it might be of interest to American readers in the late 1950s, the time of the civil rights movement in the United States, and so she brought it to light. The author of this account at the time of the Haitian Revolution was a young man who had been born in Saint-Domingue. His family owned a large plantation there. It took a lot of detective work on the part of myself and my German collaborator, Professor Anja Bandau from Hanover University, to discover his name. The account is anonymous, but we did eventually discover that it was written by a man whose name was Jean-Paul Ph.D. And in 2015, Professor Bandau and I published for the very first time the complete French manuscript of this account. And we gave a talk together about it in Paris. And a man came up to us after the talk and he said, "I'm so glad you have published this. I am a descendant of Jean-Paul Ph.D., and would you like to see a picture of him?" We had never imagined that such a thing might exist. But his family, down through his family, had come this portrait of Jean-Paul Ph.D. as a child. It was customary for white families who owned plantations to send their sons back to France for their education. And so these young boys, when they got to be 8 or 9 years old, they would go to France by themselves, they would be in boarding school, and then they might come back 8, 10, 12 years later to manage the plantations. And I suspect that the family had this portrait of their son made when he went off to France, because in those days there was always the chance that the child might not survive and they might never see him again. So this is the only one of these accounts where we have a picture of the man who wrote it. And it is an extremely interesting account. He was a very good writer, and he tells us of many interesting episodes that he experienced in the course of the Haitian Revolution. One that has become kind of symbolic of the Haitian Revolution is his description of a one-to-one combat with one of the blacks who had joined the insurrection. Early in the story, he joins the white militia that's fighting them, and here's his story of his encounter with this black man. "I pursued a Negro whose regalia caused me to judge him to be one of the principal chiefs. As I was about to overtake him, he turned around, took aim, but happily for me could not make his powder fire as it was too damp. I prepared myself to cleave his head with my sword, whereupon he fell to his knees, kissed my boots, and told me with tears in his eyes that he was my mother's godson, that he was present at my birth and carried me in his arms more than once, and he beseeched me not to kill him, that he was a good Negro and that he had always loved the whites. His manner disarmed me. I dismounted from my horse before having him conducted to camp. However, a soft sound made me quickly turn my head, and I saw the miserable hypocrite who had recharged his gun, aiming point blank at my head. Being troubled at finding himself discovered prevented him from aiming accurately, and the bullet went past me. I fell upon him, but he was on guard for my attack, and there we were, both acting as if playing prisoner's base. And here, Jean-Paul Pied does something very interesting. He starts writing in verse, a kind of rap artist account of the Haitian Revolution. And I haven't been able to translate this into good English poetry, but he writes, "Although lame, the fellow was agile and ran all around the field the way Hector did once upon a time. When pursued by angry Achilles, he went 7 times around the walls of Ilium, like a rabbit without looking behind him. I had no Patroclus to avenge, but more than Achilles, I was light-footed, thanks first of all to my slim build, and then to that Greek from the Faubourg Saint-Marceau, who, seeing in us apprentice heroes, every morning in his Olympic furor gave us lessons in gymnastics." And then he goes back to writing in prose. "I caught my runner at the moment when he was about to slash me and threw him into some weeds. Even then he had the impudence to maintain that I had not seen correctly and that he loved the son of his godmother too much to try to kill him. When he heard himself convicted by a number of soldiers who had just arrived and had witnessed the incident, he changed his tune and told me in his jargon," and here's a passage that's in Creole in the original manuscript, "Master, I know that it is true. It is the devil who gets inside of this body of mine. I am a good Negro, but against my will, the devil is too strong." His excuse made me laugh despite my anger, and had I been alone, I would certainly have saved him. But the soldiers seized him and bound him to a tree to be shot. When he saw that his fate was sealed, he began to laugh, sing, and joke. At times, however, reviling us in a furious tone, at times jeering at us in mockery. He gave the signal himself and met death without fear or complaint. We found in one of his pockets pamphlets printed in France, filled with commonplaces about the rights of man and the sacred insurrection. In his vest was a large packet of tinder and phosphate of lime. On his chest he had a little sack full of hair, herbs, bits of bone, which they call a fetish. With this, they expect to be sheltered from all danger, and it was no doubt because of this amulet that our man had the intrepidity which the philosophers call stoicism. Here again is a passage, first of all, that reminds us how often fighters on the two sides in this struggle wound up fighting against people they knew, people who they had relationships with. Another striking thing is how this passage reveals the influence of Vodou, the religion created by the black slaves in Saint-Domingue, on the insurgents. When the black man says, "It's not me, it's the devil who possessed me that made me try to shoot you," that's very evocative of the way Vodou worshippers understand themselves to be possessed by spirits or deities during Vodou rituals, and I think reflects Vodou beliefs. And again, the fact that this man has this packet of herbs and bones, that's a very typical kind of amulet used in Vodou observances, and we can kind of see that this religion was already developed at the time of the Revolution. On the other hand, the claim that he had in his pockets printed pamphlets from France about the Declaration of the Rights of Man, this is more dubious. We have a tremendous amount of evidence from the French side about the Haitian Revolution. Not one actual copy of a revolutionary pamphlet has been found or is referred to in those documents. But the whites were convinced, they were absolutely, the white plantation owners were convinced that there was a conspiracy of white abolitionists in France to smuggle this kind of literature to the slaves, to set them against the colonial system. So I think this is a case of somebody making up something that he thinks has to have happened, even though he has no real evidence for it. That part may not be literally true, but what clearly comes through in this story is this white man's respect for this black man who keeps his wits about him even when he realizes he's probably going to be executed, who tries every possible argument to save his life, but when he realizes he can't do that, who defies the whites, and who dies as a hero. So I think this is a very impressive portrait of the blacks who participated in this uprising, given by a man who had no doubt in his mind at all, as his overall manuscript shows, about the rightness of slavery, about the superiority of whites over blacks. But in this episode, he recognizes that he has dealt with a man who's at least his equal, if not his superior. Let me conclude my talk with a couple of passages that are very important from a third account of a white man who's involved in these very first episodes of the uprising. This is a man named Gabriel Gros. He's the owner of a small coffee plantation in Saint-Domingue at the time of the Revolution, and also an officer in the local militia in the district where he lives. And he is taken prisoner a couple of months after the start of the insurrection, when his district is overrun by the blacks. By the time he is taken prisoner, the original leader of the insurrection, Boukman Dutti, had been killed in battle, and the leadership of the black movement had been taken over by two men who kind of shared the command, Jean-François Papillon and Georges Biassou. And Gros is taken prisoner, and he meets both of these men, and also a man who at this point is playing a kind of secondary role in the black leadership, a certain Toussaint of Breda, who we recognize as the future Toussaint Louverture. And Gros gets very involved with these black leaders. The blacks have killed some of their white prisoners. Gros, understandably, does not want to be the next person killed. So he asks himself, how can I make myself useful to these blacks so that they will spare my life? And he realizes that one of the things they need, one of the things that they require, is somebody who can write letters to the whites on the other side so that they can have some kind of negotiation about how they are going to resolve the situation created by the uprising. So Gros goes and offers himself, this is the very end of my remarks, Charles. He goes and offers himself to Jean-François Biassou and says, I would be happy to work as your secretary. And so they are willing to accept this offer, and he therefore has a lot of one-to-one contact with these black leaders. And he learns, he comes to realize that they are intelligent people. He writes, for example, about Jean-François. Jean-François approved of everything that was proposed to him and even spoke an extraordinary language to us for a Negro. His reflections carried with them a degree of good sense, a fund of humanity, an array of genius far superior to any sentiment that might have been expected from his kind, for even after my emancipation, plucking up courage enough to ask him what the design of the war that he was waging against us was, his reply proved a most candid and categorical one. These were his expressions: "I did not institute myself a general of the Negroes. Those who had the power of conferring the title have invested me with it. In taking up arms, I never pretended to fight for the general liberty of the country, which I know to be merely chimerical, as well by the need France has of her colonies as by the danger there would be in obtaining for this uncivilized set of beings a right which would be infinitely more dangerous to them and which would indubitably draw along with it the annihilation of the colony." So here we have a long speech by Jean-Francois, one that indicates that he himself didn't think this movement could really successfully create an independent black country, and giving his reasons for this. Now, there's a patronizing tone, obviously, to what Gros writes here. For him, the highest proof of Jean-Francois' intelligence is that he accepts Gros' arguments to him about why your movement will not succeed. But nevertheless, there's also an acknowledgement that Jean-Francois is a person who thinks carefully about things and comes to reasonable judgments about them. Even more striking is what Gros writes about his encounters with Toussaint of Breda, the future Toussaint Louverture. These are, as far as I know, the very first descriptions of Toussaint's role in the Haitian Revolution. We don't actually know much about whether Toussaint participated in the early stages of the uprising, other than the fact that he saves his former master and his family. This is the point at which we first hear about him. So the negotiations are going on between the whites and the black leaders about a possible resolution to the movement that would lead the blacks to put down their arms and go back to the plantations. And the negotiations are not going well. And Gros writes, "Had it not been for the assistant of the Negro, Toussaint, belonging to Breda, the conference would have terminated unsuccessfully. At first, he exacted 300 liberties. That is, in exchange for the black leaders getting the other blacks to go back to the plantations, they wanted 300 black leaders to be granted their freedom. So at first he exacted 300 liberties, exclusive of those meant to gratify his family, but after many perilous debates, I got him to determine on 50. So Gros finds Toussaint to be a very reasonable person with whom you can bargain, and he gets him to reduce his demands. But then the negotiations break down altogether, and Gros writes, "At the time of so hazardous an occurrence as this was, Toussaint of Breda, braving all danger, attempted to save us, though he might have been himself the victim of these monsters' rage. He represented that we could not and ought not to be thus sacrificed without being imprisoned and calling a court-martial upon us." And this again is a very short passage, but it shows us a lot, I think, about Toussaint Louverture. It shows us that in the midst of this violent uprising, he is thinking about how do you set up a society that's governed by law, that has rules, where even people like these whites are not simply killed without any rhyme or reason. And Toussaint undoubtedly realized if the white prisoners are killed, any chance of a negotiated peace settlement with the whites will be scuttled. I think he's also thinking the way we prove to the whites that we are serious, intelligent people with whom they ought to be willing to deal is to show them that we can set up a system of laws, we can set up a court, we can treat prisoners fairly, the way we wish they would treat us. So in just these couple of sentences, I think we get a sense of the very sophisticated ability to think about politics that was going to allow Toussaint to become the leader of this movement we call the Haitian Revolution, and whose anniversary we are celebrating today. Do we still have time for some questions? I'll be very happy to answer any questions that I can and discuss with you materials. But thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for coming.
A proud Haitian here. A number of times as you spoke, you mentioned the works of white people.
Yes.
And used their words to illustrate what was going on through the minds of Black people. Explain to me why you would imagine that the perspectives and interpretations of white people from their vantage point could accurately illustrate what Black people felt or thought or were strategizing. Explain to me.
Well, what I have to say is these are the only versions of the words spoken by these Black people that we have. If we had documents from Black participants, we'd have a much more direct sense of what they were thinking. But we have to work with the evidence that we have got. And as I said, I do think that it's important that these white people often knew the Black people they were speaking to. They did have some kind of relationship with them in many cases. And they often tell us things about Black people that are not what we might expect whites to want to believe about Black people. But I understand the issue that you're raising. It's a very important one. As historians, we have to do the best we can with the records that have come down to us from the past. And as I said, we try to, as we say, read them against the grain for messages that may not be what their authors intended, but that we can see kind of seeping through in spite of what the whites might have intended. But I agree with you, you are absolutely right, and I have made no secret of it. These are accounts by white people. Sometimes they are undeniably distorted or reflect white attitudes rather than what Blacks were probably thinking. That really is all I can say to you.
My response needs to be heard, and it's that the tradition that you are trained in privileges documentation or evidence only as it's written. But that is not the only way that history is accurately captured and shared and passed on. My culture shares information through oral histories, through stories, through songs that would require you to empower Haitians to go and talk to Haitians and capture from them things that, based on your training, are deemed inaccurate or insignificant, but are really more accurate than any white person's writings about what they think someone thought at the time. The same way as your partner, in speaking to you, couldn't say what you thought or what you really felt. Anybody is a mystery to someone else, especially if the dynamic of the relationship already has at the heart an idea that someone is inferior, which is what we're talking about when we're referring to these white slave owners. It is not simply a matter of dealing with the evidence available. It is saying the tradition of my way of approaching history and those in my tradition privilege documentation as writing, And so we don't see or privilege or value any other forms of capturing the truth. And for that, it's wrong.
I also am a proud Haitian American.
Okay.
I'm not as articulate as this young lady was. So it was a couple things that bothered me about your statements.
All right.
The fact that you would say that and two things. I'm kind of highly upset at this museum because I know that you've heard things this man has said. I was going to bring my mother here today. And what a slap in the face would it have been for her to grow up in a country that she's so proud of and to hear the things on a day of celebration. I mean, in return, and I'm sorry because I'm really upset right now, but in return, if it was 9/11, would you have went to another country and brought someone on the other side to celebrate 9/11 and explain their side of 9/11? And that we would sit here and clap and be proud of the things that we've heard. Like, I was very disappointed by the audience for clapping at the end of this presentation. To say that a white man was shot and beat and was left for dead, and then to say that women came back and raped him and put their genitals in his
let's say.
Well, you said put their genitals in his face and around his mouth in this oral area. To say that, it's very hard for me to see you sit here and say that a pamphlet wasn't true, but you would think that was true.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, the gentleman that you were talking about, Jean-Baptiste, that was a slave in Barbados and ended up wasn't he eventually in Virginia, in the state of Virginia, in the United States?
I'm sorry, who?
The Jean-Baptiste gentleman, wasn't he a slave in Barbados?
Jean-Francois, I'm not sure if he came from Barbados. He wound up as a...
Jean-Baptiste Belay.
Belay.
Belay?
Yes. No, he stays in France and eventually dies there.
Well, no. When I was reading about him online, it said that he was a slave in Barbados, and then eventually went to Virginia. Yeah. So, and I know that this is written by somebody else, but it just doesn't seem correct.
I think his life is quite well documented. He serves in the French forces in Saint-Domingue. We have quite a few documents about him. He's elected as a deputy to the French legislature.
Right. And he was a fighter against the colony.
He is actually a fighter on the French side in the colony, and then a deputy in the French national legislature, and later an officer in Napoleon's army for a few years.
So basically he was a traitor. And he turned his back on his people and gave up important information.
Well, if he is a traitor, Toussaint Louverture is even more of a traitor. He serves as Governor General of the colony for 4 years.
But this gentleman, if you want to say, Baptiste was a traitor, so why was Baptiste kidnapped and put in prison and eventually was murdered? But these two gentlemen are traitors?
It's not Jean-Baptiste Belay who is in prison. It's Toussaint Louverture.
If Toussaint was kidnapped later after the war and took to France and was put in prison and later died in prison, but this gentleman was a traitor and lived this wonderful life, that doesn't add up to me.
Well, as far as Belay was concerned, the French had freed their slaves. They've elected him to their legislature. Being part of the French government as he was, struck him as taking advantage of the opportunity for freedom that the French revolutionaries had, with much delay and reluctance, actually extended. The story of Toussaint Louverture and the French is another complicated one. Toussaint Louverture joins the French forces in 1794 when the French agree to abolish slavery. He rises to become the commander of all the French forces in Saint-Domingue and the governor general of the colony. When Napoleon comes to power in 1802, Napoleon dismisses Toussaint and then has him taken prisoner, and he is shipped back to France. but Napoleon's army is not able to defeat the black resistance led by Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and that is how Haiti becomes independent.
Yeah, but, okay. How long have you been doing this?
Unfortunately, only for one short trip, I'm sorry.
No, I mean, how long have you been sharing this information about Haiti?
For about 15 years.
15 years, and you've only traveled to Haiti one time and to discuss with people their history.
I've talked to a number of Haitians here and in France,
Okay.
but yes, however, for the historical documents for this period, they are in France. You do not find them in Haiti. I'm sorry.
I do have one question about the literacy situation. Okay, I'm sorry, no, I can't get down there, I got bad.
Yeah, I can hear you.
I wanted to speak to or question you about the literacy situation in terms of the point that you made about, okay. I'm questioning about the point that you made about there was a supposition that there were abolitionist pieces sent to Haiti. What was the literacy situation for African people that were enslaved in Haiti? Were they allowed to read? Were they literate?
Very few of them were able to read. There were some. I found an advertisement in one of the newspapers at the time from the owner of the newspaper. His slave, his personal slave, had run away. He says he can read and write because I took him to France for a number of years. So that's one example of a black. Toussaint Louverture could read and write. And recently a historian has studied the manuscripts that Toussaint Louverture wrote in his own handwriting. He could read and write, but his French spelling was not very good. And from the spelling, this man has concluded that he must have spoken French with a very heavy accent from the part of France that his original owner came from. So we have some examples, but very, very few. Most of the blacks could not read.
And then I have one of the things that I'd like to share with you as an observation. As an African American,
Yes.
The term slaves is troublesome to me because it is something that seems to are you predisposed to a hierarchy that is not necessarily just. I find that enslavement works better, or those who are enslaved works better for my consciousness.
Okay.
That's all I'd like to share with you. Okay,
thank
you.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. From an artist standpoint, I know many times people will portray things from their cultural perspective.
Yes.
And they'll be very enthusiastic about it. You know, in this sense, you have been. So it's not necessarily so identifiable with the group here. But what I did want to, but you gave a lot of insight on history. What I did want to know, though, is from an oral stamp, academically, has any or is anything being done for the oral history of everything that took place?
There has been a very interesting study of the oral traditions about the Bois Quémant ceremony, where we think the blacks made the last preparations for the uprising in August of 1791 by a Haitian anthropologist, Rachel Beauvoir-Dominique, I think. There's some difficulty with recovering these oral traditions in what you might call all their purity, because it's more than 200 years now, and the story of the start of the Haitian Revolution has been taught in Haitian schools for all that time. So there are stories circulating, that people tell them orally, but they often seem to be derived from the kind of textbook versions of this story that have been around now for many, many years. So you do have to wonder, are we getting a kind of pure, unfiltered version of an oral tradition, or are we getting an oral tradition that has kind of been blended with traditions that are related through history books?
Okay,
So
yeah,
on.
similar to when you said the man presented prose, and so that wasn't just like right on key, but you know, we had some insight about it. You know, the same thing with Jesus or whatever name you wish to call him. You know how so much is done from a cultural standpoint, where Jesus will sometimes even look, you know, Asian, very Asiatic, when actually, you know, from the territory that he was from, he was black. But I just, you know, was wondering about that. And it's interesting that you brought up about the Haitian schools. Did have documents there. Did have that history there. So I didn't know that. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. Can we give Dr. Jeremy Popkin a round of applause for his presentation?